Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. This is Boris Tizengausen with you. Today is October 1st, and the episode is going to be packed. There's a lot of news. So, in this episode, a triple blow. Today, Russians were hit with sanctions from the SBU, the GUR, and the unmanned systems forces, the elimination of a scandalous Putin official. Now collaborators are wondering who will be next. Trump's meeting with the generals, what was most important at that meeting, and what war the US is preparing for. They talked about that at the meeting. A fuel catastrophe in Russia. Statistics have been published, and the situation turned out to be much worse than anyone expected. And a group of Euro officials is proposing to finally close the skies over Western Ukraine, while in the US, there are plans to transfer Putin's billions to Ukraine. There will be a lot of interesting things about this and more in today's episode. So if this is your first time on this channel, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. And I'd like to start today by noting that today is October 1st, the day of defenders of Ukraine, both men and women. My sincere congratulations to you. You are true heroes. I wish everyone who is now defending our country to return home alive to their loved ones. And to those who gave their lives for Ukraine, eternal glory. Ukrainians have shown the whole world how to fight for their freedom, for their land. So congratulations to you. You are true heroes. And before moving on to the meeting with American generals, where the US called, as I remind you, to prepare for war, I'll start, as usual, with Magyar's sanctions. And today it's a triple strike. This morning, yet another Russian oil refinery is burning. And have you noticed that there are far fewer of those Russian comments like, cluck, 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 we've got 100 billion of those refineries, it's just mosquito bites? See? There are a lot fewer now. So, the commander of Ukraine's drone forces, and apparently at the same time, Russia's new Minister of Energy, Magyar, is working systematically. Not a day goes by without some Russian oil refinery encountering Ukrainian drones. So, as soon as lines for gasoline appeared in Russia, as soon as gas stations started closing, as soon as they began rationing fuel and limiting the amount per person, everyone immediately quieted down. Of course, it won't have a cascading effect right away. The entire Russian oil refining industry won't collapse instantly, but soon there simply won't be enough fuel for the gas stations. And today, Russian RBC has published statistics that are terrible for Russians and joyful for us. After the attacks by Ukrainian drones, 38% of Russia's oil refining capacity has come to a halt. So just imagine, gasoline production in September dropped by 1 million tons, and the deficit has already reached 20%. So those mosquito bites, well, study the tactic of 1,000 cuts. And the second blow, now sanctions from the GUR. Just yesterday, I mentioned that the GUR issued black marks to 13 high-ranking Russian military officials responsible for missile strikes on Ukraine. And now, a very, very interesting piece of news has come in. Just the other day, a lieutenant colonel of the Russian National Guard and 2 other thugs with him were eliminated. And what's more, this happened near a training ground. The settlement, Tambukan, Stavropol Krai, it's not far from Nalchik. That's where these Russian thugs were gathering. And the lieutenant colonel wasn't just anyone. He was a lieutenant colonel of the Russian National Guard who led the enemy special unit Avangard. So they were getting ready to go to the training ground. They got into vehicles, a minibus and a car. The lieutenant colonel was sitting in the car, and somewhere in the woods there was a powerful explosion, and well, that lieutenant colonel and 2 more thugs who were traveling with him were blown to pieces. And let me remind you, friends, we have an important fundraiser for the legendary 3rd Assault Brigade to get drones for our warriors. The commanders have reached out to us, so let's help them. There's just a little bit left to go. Let's give it an extra push on Defender of the Fatherland Day. Let's help our heroes. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. The link to the fundraiser is also in the comments. There's Mono, Private, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. A huge thank you to all of you. They are protecting us. Let's help our warriors. But that's not all yet. The third strike, as they say, 3 nuts for the Botox Cinderella over there in the Kremlin. Sanctions from the SBU. This morning, during a drone attack, the chairman of the Council of Deputies of the occupied Nova Kakhovka, Vladimir Leontiev, was seriously wounded. This was reported by another traitor, Saldo, whom Putin appointed as governor of the Kherson region. And Saldo wrote that Leontiev is in the hospital. Later it turned out that he actually died there in the hospital and immediately followed Kyiv straight to hell. Just look, you take this traitor any one of them, take a quick look at their biography and you realize this is a textbook scumbag. And I think that's exactly the principle by which they are selected. I mean, who else would go be a traitor and serve Putin? Who? So this Leontiev is no exception. There's not a spot left to brand him. He's worked all sorts of jobs, including at the company Chumak, from which he was kicked out for organizing an underground production of fake ketchup and sunflower oil in Donetsk. And today I came across a video from a resident of Nova Kakhovka who talks about this Leontiev, saying that he was a rat everywhere he worked, always stealing. But then, a few months before the full-scale invasion, he started going around to farmers. He started visiting businessmen and checking their loyalty. That is, he understood, he knew, and the Russians were preparing him to govern the occupied territory. But he wasn't only involved in economic crimes. A year ago in Ukraine, he was tried for the abduction of Oleg Baturin, a journalist from Kakhovka, Mykola Rezak, the mayor of Tavrisk, and Dmitro Vasilyev, the secretary of the Nova Kakhovka City Council. He was sentenced to 15 years, but it seems the process has accelerated. Well, as for him, oh, by the way, I think he was recruited much earlier. He worked as a political officer in the Russian army, then came to Ukraine and started his activities here. And as for Saldo himself, who reported this, unfortunately, he is still skillfully dodging sanctions. But that's only for now. Generals Moskalik and, what's his name, the second one, Kirillov, can vouch for that straight from hell. Basically, they're all dancing in circles there now with Keosayan and Kobzon. Now, moving on to the meeting with the generals in the US, where they called to prepare for war. You've probably heard that in the US, they gathered practically all the generals and admirals to hear a speech from the Secretary of War. That's what the head of the Pentagon is called now. Well, Trump also spoke. I'll start with Trump by seniority. Trump once again called Russia a paper tiger, even though he had previously promised not to do that. And here's a quote: "I'm so disappointed in Putin. I thought he would handle this quickly. He should have finished this war in a week. I told Putin, you look bad. You've been fighting a war for 4 years that should have lasted a week. Are you a paper tiger or what?" Trump said. And he also called Medvedev, the deputy chairman of the Security Council, stupid. He called him that, even though he didn't mention his name. But from the context, it's clear. Here, Russia made some mild threats against us not long ago, and I sent nuclear submarines. I did it because that person over there mentioned the word nuclear. It was a stupid person who works for Putin. I sent a submarine or two to the shores of Russia just as a precaution. We can't allow people to throw that word around carelessly, the word nuclear. Of course, Medvedev immediately commented on Trump's statement. He wrote the following: "As was said in the legendary Soviet detective series, the outcome is obvious. It's hard to find a black cat in a dark room, especially if it's not there." He wrote this on the social network X. Well, in Medvedev's case, it's easy to find a squirrel in any room, especially when it's actually there. But Medvedev hinted that Trump is bluffing and that he never sent any submarines anywhere. See how it is? And Trump also said that we are ahead of Russia and China in submarines by about 25 years. Russia is in second place, China is in third. But they're catching up. In 5 years, they'll be on par, they'll catch up, Trump said. We're ahead by 25 years, but in 5 years, they'll catch up to us. All right, got it. Well, and Trump also announced his intention to organize a meeting with Zelensky and Putin to end the war. We'll have only one thing left to do, to resolve the situation with President Putin and Zelensky. We'll bring them together and settle everything. But this can only be done from a position of strength. If we were weak, they wouldn't even take my call. But we have tremendous strength. So, well, where is it? Well, where is this tremendous strength? So, what's the point of you constantly cooing with Putin that he picks up the phone when you call? Who even needs all this cooing? And the US Secretary of Defense, Hexet, or rather, not the Secretary of Defense, but the Secretary of War, as I think it's called now, at a meeting of generals also called on the military, just like the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff did earlier, to prepare for war. In other words, get ready for war. The US must be ready for war in order to protect peace. If our enemies act foolishly and decide to challenge us, they will be crushed by the brutality, precision, and ferocity of the Department of War. We have the strongest, most lethal army on the planet. No one can even come close to matching us. I, for one, have no doubt whatsoever that the American army really is powerful, well-equipped, and well-trained. But in history, there were still 2 wars that really ended with nothing. Well, there were more wars, but these ones, Vietnam and Afghanistan. The wars went on for 20 years each. Well, how do you even comment on that? Were those wars supposed to be over in a week too, or what? And the main question, who are we supposed to fight and what kind of war would it be? Will it involve ground operations, or will it be an exchange of nuclear strikes or non-nuclear strikes, or, I don't know, will satellites be disabled? What kind of war will it be and with whom? That's the question. And, well, there are two options. So first of all, the US is now transferring tanker aircraft, which used to fly to Europe, to the Middle East. Some of the planes are already at the base in Qatar, while others are waiting to depart from British bases. And public channels are reporting that a similar buildup was observed before the last attack on Iran. So maybe that's the war being discussed? Maybe something is being prepared there? But let me remind you, the day before, Donald Trump met with the Prime Minister of Israel. Of course, it was about Gaza, that's clear, but they're preparing for different scenarios. So it seems like Hamas is sending some signals of agreement regarding Trump's plan for a peace settlement in Gaza. But we both know very well that the proxies there might raise their heads. Iran, I think these are measures aimed at Iran to make sure none of their proxy groups make any sudden moves. And Hegseth said that the Pentagon's new mission will be exclusively conducting military operations. From this moment on, the sole mission of the recently restored Ministry of War is to fight wars, prepare for war, and prepare for victory. The United States must be ready for war in order to protect peace.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Well, all right. By the way, I distinctly had the strong feeling that the assembled generals and admirals in the Grand Hall had a great many pressing questions, because Hegseth was speaking to them like some kind of highly motivational coach, really. He was truly speaking like a passionate preacher, delivering an impassioned sermon. And the generals were just sitting there thinking, why? I mean, they could have not gathered all of us here just for this. Well, it felt like there should have been some kind of serious message. There were a lot of questions. All right then. The army is the deadliest, the fiercest, the toughest. But you have an obvious aggressor, the Russian Federation, your adversary. So from a position of strength, we'll resolve this. I told Putin that he's a loser and so on. But where is the pressure? Where is it? Go ahead and show it already. And of course, as they say, the cherry on top, there will be no more transgender people in the American army, nor will there be any overweight, bearded, or long-haired soldiers. And absolutely no dresses or anything like that. In the original words, this crap is over. In general, it's unacceptable to see overweight generals and admirals. Everyone should look good and so on. This was stated by Pete Hegseth. You could say it's a kind of fashion verdict. And by the way, there's another area where a war could break out. So far, that's not the case. But the situation is heating up and could quickly spiral out of control. We're talking about Venezuela. There is currently a rather sharp escalation in the Caribbean between the US and Venezuela because the Americans are striking at so-called narco boats. These are sea vessels used to transport drugs. They strike hard, and it's not just the illegal substances involved. Those accompanying them, and sometimes even illegal refugees, can be on board as well. So the US has already carried out 3 strikes since September 2nd, 3 lethal attacks on speedboats in the southern part of the Caribbean Sea. And yes, the Dominican Republic has confirmed that they seized 1 ton of illegal substances from a boat with more than a dozen people killed, which sparked a lot of controversy. So the American naval group is already off the coast of Venezuela. And of course, Nicolas Maduro, the dictator, buddy of Putin and Lukashenko, announced a state of emergency and put the armed forces on high alert. He's throwing around some crazy numbers. He says, I can mobilize 4 million, 5 million people under arms. Of course, that's not true. By the way, before this, Trump mocked the Venezuelan recruits. There was a video, where various recruits, some round, some skinny, were running around. And Trump reposted that video and laughed at it. So basically, Maduro is putting everything he has on combat alert. He's got Russian weapons, Buk missile systems, Igla manpads. In other words, Putin supplied him with all that back in the day. And he's also putting his police force on combat alert. So yes, that's the situation. And of course, Maduro is being actively supported by Russia and Iran, and China is also involved. First of all, on May 7th of this year, Russia signed a strategic partnership with Venezuela. See, there you go. We'll start with Maduro, I don't know, start with Cuba right next door, and then deal with Russia, I don't know. Plus, there's localization. Maduro has cooperation with Russia on ammunition and the local production of Kalashnikovs. By the way, Maduro stole a ton of money during the construction of that Kalashnikov factory. Well, anyway, now they're probably going to finish building it. And then there's Iran. Since the 2000s, they've had close cooperation with Iran on drones. You see, in the club of dictators, one scumbag helps another, and they're all happy about it. We'll get to that in a moment as well. So now Maduro has both kamikaze drones and reconnaissance drones. Thanks to Iran, just like Putin can also say, thanks to Iran. So it's the same old faces in the ring, only the club of dictators, unlike the civilized West, pardon my French, hasn't fallen out with each other or slapped tariffs on one another. On the contrary, they've actually consolidated. They've set up a system of mutual cover, and for them, it's all for one and one for all. And they're not reducing military cooperation, for example, like how the US is planning to withdraw troops from Europe or is planning to stop supporting Russia's neighbors, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, NATO countries. And according to the latest data, over 80% of Venezuelan households are living in poverty. Millions have left, but the regime still holds on. So there you have it. But these are the possible scenarios where Donald Trump wants to wage war in the near future. And a group of high-ranking Western politicians and military officials have proposed deploying air defense systems over Western Ukraine to shoot down Russian missiles and drones. The Telegraph reports this, and then to eventually extend this shield further, up to Kyiv and beyond, as far as it can reach. I quote, "Since the Russian air campaign is being conducted with drones and long-range missiles launched from deep within Russian airspace, such an operation to close the skies carries the risk of Russian military personnel being killed. However, this would demonstrate that Europe is determined enough to repel air invasions and is willing to take certain risks for that. And for Putin, this would be a signal, yes. Look, for example, Erdogan, I've mentioned this in every episode, proved that you can shoot down a Russian plane with its crew, not just a missile or a drone where there's no pilot. You see? And what did the war start? No, there was a tomato war. Putin wagged his finger from the Kremlin, and that was it. That's why this is an important issue. It should have been done a long time ago. Well, it's clear they decided to do it now because drones started flying into their territory. So unfortunately, the issue here isn't about Ukraine. Even though Ukraine is offering all kinds of assistance. And yes, we need to be more decisive in this case. The more decisive Europe is, the less room for maneuver Putin has. Because I guarantee you that right now, provocations there, with sabotage groups, with drones, with combat payloads, will continue. There in Germany, I saw today, these drones are already flying in swarms over military facilities. Well, in general, yes. A resolution was introduced in the US Senate calling for the transfer of Russian assets to Ukraine at a rate of $10 billion per month. The author of the resolution is US Senator John Kennedy. He is a Republican from Louisiana. And the resolution also calls on the G7 and European Union leaders to seize sovereign assets and transfer them to Ukraine in tranches of $10 billion per month. I think it's a wonderful decision. But just recently, Macron suddenly started defending Russian assets and said they shouldn't be touched. Otherwise, the reputation of Europe's financial institutions would suffer. Remind me, the reputation of financial institutions. Before that, the alcoholic Medvedev, whom Trump called stupid, threatened European officials with physical violence if anyone touched Russian assets. Here, no one's reputation is suffering. I don't know if Medvedev called Macron. Maybe he was breathing heavily, threatening him with his booze breath over the phone. But it was unexpected to hear that from Macron. And the idea of transferring certain sums until Putin ends the war is an excellent idea. If, at the same time, the United States sells NATO the weapons we need, and we can use these tranches to pay for those purchases, that would be perfect. In other words, taking out the occupiers with their own money is a brilliant idea. Thanks to the esteemed senator from Louisiana. But unfortunately, it feels like in this era of cowards, Russian assets will remain untouched. And then they'll go back to the Kremlin. And then someone might suddenly get a tempting offer from Russia, like becoming a member of the supervisory board of some Russian oil and gas company, and receive a hefty salary or pension. By the way, this is exactly how Russia has already corrupted dozens of European officials. There are plenty of other ways to corrupt people. You could make an entire program just about that. For example, someone might ask you to write a book, or if you've already written one, they might say, how about you print an extra run of 20,000 copies and we'll buy them all. You see what I mean? In other words, or suddenly in some country there's an unexpected demand for an extra print run of your book. So, well, all of this is also completely official, seemingly legal. Well, not in Russia, for example, so those Botox ears don't stick out too much, but in some other country. Or they might invite you to give a lecture or a series of lectures in some country. You get paid a lot of money for your talent. Some officials in the US have also gotten into trouble over this, but here everything is official. That is, suddenly someone decides to pay you a lot of money for your talent, for your lectures. Peskov, by the way, commenting on the EU's plans to allocate 2 billion for drones from the interest on Russian assets, not from the assets themselves, but from the interest, stated that this is an illegal seizure of Russian property, an act of theft. He emphasized that if someone wants to illegally appropriate assets, those involved will be prosecuted. Peskov noted that such actions will lead to a complete destruction of trust in the principle of property inviolability. Listen, just how crazy are they, right? They occupied foreign territories, seized, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, steal grain, loot the occupied territories, and then talk about the principle of property inviolability. A representative of an army of looters who took everything from Ukrainian homes, including plumbing fixtures, is now discussing the inviolability of private property. It's just unbelievable. Simply unbelievable. Well, friends, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Subscribe to this channel. Let's support our warriors, our heroes from the 3rd Assault Brigade. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.